Hello, thank you for joining us and welcome to our third webinar, this time asking, are you really using BIM? Talking to professionals in the construction sector, I found BIM can be quite a polarizing subject, particularly in terms of how it's used, who leads, and how to maximize its benefits. These are all points I hope we'll cover in our discussion today with our panel. We'll look at some of the different uses and opportunities of BIM, focus on benefits, and include as many examples of use cases as we can. My name is Rob Jones, partner at B2B Connect, and joining me are Juan Tena Florez, Regional Digital Design Manager at KEO International Consultants, Wissam Hijazi, Director VDC for the Middle East at EllisDon, Alain Waha, Global Head of BIM and Digital at BuroHappold, and Arsen Safaryan, Head of BIM at Alec. Before we leap in, I want to quickly flag our Construction Technology Awards, which are now open. The awards celebrate new approaches and best-in-class use of technology within the built environment. They look for outstanding examples of technology implementation, transformation, and leadership that are changing the way construction companies work and how projects are delivered. The URL for the awards is on your screen now, as are the categories, including the subject of today's discussion, BIM. This category will focus on how BIM has been planned and implemented on a project, and we're looking for entries to demonstrate how it has been successfully applied. Entries are open to contractors, consultants, developers, or project owners, and our judges, who are all experts in their field, look forward to seeing them. I also want to just briefly flag our virtual conference, which will be a half-day event taking place on the 21st of October. The virtual conference will look at a number of topics, including BIM, as we are today, plus the use of AI in design, build and handover, the security and integrity of big data in construction, how to build a digital strategy, showing ROI on digital projects, and laser scanning, a very popular subject in our last webinar. Moving on to our discussion today. I'm going to start near the end of the process, and then I'll drag it right back to the beginning so that we can really explore who needs to be involved, who do you need to bring together, and how do you make sure that BIM is successfully used. We'll also welcome your questions. So please, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box and we'll answer them towards the end of the webinar. So leaping to the end. Wissam, in general, are the benefits of using BIM, such as operational gains, clear enough to clients, accepting that there are always clients who are fully bought in? If not, what's missing in their understanding, and how do you show the ROI and value of BIM to them?
Thank you, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, the big question when it comes to ROI is always to look at your investments from a CapEx and an OpEx perspective. Obviously, the added value and the benefits of BIM are kind of clear from a design and construction, but the big picture is at the operation. And when you talk about BIM at an operation level, the key item here is data. Data, this is now priceless at this stage. Imagine this data is being utilized for all of your as-builts, for all of the history of the project. You need to think about it as a single source of truth with all accurate information that can run your operation and maintenance. This is where you have your 80% of your cost from an OpEx perspective. And this is where the real added value. The return of investment will come from an accuracy of information, the ease of the way that you can get to that piece of information, how you can perform operations and manuals, FM activities in a more efficient way because of the accuracy of the data. So regardless of what will be the different usages from an as-built perspective, whether you're doing a new rent, a new handover, a new fit out, an extension, you always need to go back to the as-built data information. And this is where the BIM is going to provide you with the main added value. So the clients, they need to look at it as an overall picture. And we started to see this in the market here in the UAE. So now we started to see more requests of BIM added value to FM operations. We started to hear more about the added value of digital twins to optimize energy, to optimize sustainability, to have a quick type of response to any specific action. So this data now, it's being generated to an operation handover where the client now is going above and beyond design and construction usages of this data.
So Juan, moving now back to the start of the process, how do you identify and quantify the value of BIM from the outset?
In order to identify the goals of BIM from the outset is clearly the outset when we have to clearly see what are the objectives of using BIM. Of course, the use of BIM is throughout all the life cycle of the project, from the strategic planning through design, construction, and of course, until facility management, operations, and maintenance. So it's important identifying that BIM, it has to be used throughout all the project life cycle. That's most of the most important decisions to take. Because if we identify the use of BIM specifically for a specific stage in the project, we are really not using BIM. And that's one of the most important things to identify. Secondly, to quantify the value of BIM, it's always challenging to give a value or a number of how much are the benefits that BIM can provide to us. No one will do a pilot of a project to start from the beginning till operations of the same project simultaneously. So it's always challenging to identify the right value of quantifying the value. It's quite clear for all of us that the value is to manage correctly the supply chain, and at the end of everyone working from the beginning under the same environment, to share information properly and to be able to disseminate that information in a structured manner.
Arsen, as organizations begin to increase their use of BIM, collaboration between departments or companies should also be increasing. Are there common challenges or common barriers that you need to overcome to make sure you have a successful use? And you're muted, Arsen.
Sorry, yeah. Well, there's always challenges when you're trying to adopt a new technology or new sets of processes between departments internally and between stakeholders externally. Definitely there's challenges. And the primary challenge we faced coming from the upstream, from the client, consultant stakeholders in the beginning years was, not labeling BIM as a source of information or source of official information that you can rely your quantification, your design decisions, your coordination on. And recently, this trend is getting away and it's getting better. More clients and consultants are referring to BIM as the main source of information fit for different use cases. That's the challenge upstream. And then we have also got a challenge downstream where we have to work with subcontractors and suppliers who, depending on their business models, size of the business and the appetite, are or aren't eager to adopt new technology. In this case, because we are the main contractor, we are sort of like a middleman, we tend to bring our supply chain up to skill with us to satisfy not only the client requirements, but also the project requirements, as well as make them feel that they, as an organization, as a stakeholder of the project, are benefiting from it. They're not necessarily duplicating processes.
Okay, so it's about bringing in both sides, your value chain downstream, and engaging the client upstream to make sure that you really can pull everything together and have that successful usage. So Alain, if that's happening, if both sides, if the contractor's kind of sitting in the middle and both sides are then working properly, I guess that means that it's helping to reduce risk in the project. Is that correct? And is it understood how to align BIM with those increased benefits?
Yes, I think that bringing the word risk is very important. It's the currency of our industry. I don't think any other industry talks about risk as much as we do, maybe with the exception of insurance itself. And that's because risk is at the heart of how our industry is structured. So if we want to make BIM work in our industry, we have to align it and talk in that currency. So let's examine the risks that each party holds and understand where BIM might help, because I think that's really a great driver for progress. So from the beginning of BIM, in fact, in the early 90s, in fact, Stanford, first seminal research was about identifying which are the risks that are eventuating in capital projects that lead to those delays and those overspend. And identifying those, then we can apply technology, call it semantic BIM, to address those risks. So, for example, a contractor, if we in that mindset, their risks is around packages, package interfaces, package integration, and making sure that their sub are assembling and integrating correctly. So we actually saw in North America the definition of LOD 350 as actually a definition of the information I need to do virtual design construction and eliminate the package interface risks. But there are many other risks that eventuate. One, about 15 to 20% of the risk is poor design understanding. So misunderstanding what the asset will actually deliver. And so that arises because the language we use to communicate, the engineers understand what they've designed and represented, but the one-off client doesn't. And so improving that communication through simulation, visual, our brain is the virtual cortex, is the most developed part of our brain. So moving the information into the geometrics and graphical representation allows us to address about 15 to 20% of the risk. So we know, and you see those things in the budgets. You see those things that anybody that is creating finance for a project would say, right, I need to have my contingency. Contingency is in fact risks eventuating. And then if you can understand how you're not going to consume that contingency because you have deployed technology to address those risks. So yes, we see it. And I think it's a really interesting narrative because it is the currency and the narrative of our industry.
Okay, so maybe that's something we need to come back to as we go through the different, in fact, as we go through the different levels of BIM. I think maybe that's something we can continue to look at is kind of how this is addressing risk. So Juan, looking at the different uses of BIM beyond 3D, I think the place to start is time sequencing. Once that's included, this brings benefits and it can help with the intricacies of planning a project to ensure the right materials are on site at the right time, which can be really helpful, I guess, when you are size constrained, there's a size constraint on the site. Can you give some examples of how the time sequencing is typically used and the type of challenges that have to be overcome?
So in that sense, our experience, we are basically design consultants, but we are also do construction supervision and project management. What we usually request the contractors to use in the use of the 4D, of the simulation, is that, first of all, to use it as a logistic plan to ensure that the logistics are taken into consideration within the timeline, within time frame, and that can be efficiently used and showcase to the client for them to take decisions earlier than after the decision has been taken. Similarly, the use of time of 4D simulation is to compare the baseline schedule of what is proposed as the progress of the activities that will be performed on site, and then to compare that baseline schedule with the actual schedule to see progress, to see how much the time is being met, and how the final deadline of completing the building or the asset will be successfully completed.
Okay, and then once you move beyond time sequencing, you add in cost. So Wissam, cost gives you greater insight for budgeting. So again, I think the similar question, examples of how it's used, the potential challenges that must be overcome.
Yeah, so obviously when we start talking about cost, and if we're talking in relative to the time, so the terminology, it's the 5D terminologies. This is where you try to assess your cost implication in regards to different phasing or to different sequencing of activities. So currently in the market, the straightforward examples we started to see are related to an early assessment of the project using the overall geometry from a cost perspective. This means that before the design is mature enough actually to be a detailed model, designers typically they start with a simple massing exercise, and based on their history and based on the market information they have kind of like a generic unit rates. So this massing exercise, it's linked to this cost. So they can try different high-level design options to see how a straightforward impact on the cost is going to be. Can we go with 2 floors for the podium? Can we go with a high ceiling, with a low ceiling? So this is where you start to see the information being more synchronized from a geometrical perspective into cost. That's number one. As we move into the project, and as Juan mentioned, the 4D time, 4D scale will be part of assessing the constructability and the monitoring. So the cost will be part of an implications related to the cash flow assessment, plus, as we're going to go into details, for the project control and monitoring. So this is also, there's certain added value from the 5D perspective over there. Currently in the market, 5D is not really being utilized to its maximum because of the cost value associated to it. There are more factors that actually drive the cost rather than just BIM straightforward applications linked to components. There are certain hidden items which drive the cost, and sometimes it's a little bit tricky to represent it in a BIM language. But we started to see that as a reference, if you want, 5D cash flow monitoring is or started to take a momentum in being addressed. Obviously, the technology needs to improve. There's certain limitation to what is the extent you can rely on this 5D so that people can take this to the next level.
Okay, so I think Arsen, actually, if I move back to you, Wissam and Juan have just been talking about cost and time sequencing. From your point of view, how are you seeing it used? And you know, Wissam's just saying there that the cost side isn't really being fully utilized yet, that there are some complications that need to be overcome. Is this something you're looking at, working on, trying to see how you can get past it?
Look, as a forward-thinking organization, we are always exploring technology, and BIM as such has different facets to it, and 5D quantification and cost control is one of those things that we're looking at. I'm going to agree with Wissam that in the market, judging from ourselves and everybody else we see around, 5D implementation is not as mature as it needs to be, but it has a greater impact in case if it matures to the levels it's required. If BIM can be utilized commercially, it will make it more successful and more beneficial. We have had a couple of tenders recently coming through where models were labeled fit for quantification, or in other words, the source of quantities. But going back to what I said earlier, it most often depends on what is the model fit for and how the client labels that model. Does he say you can use it confidently for this use case or that use case? Like I said, we've only had 2 projects in the last 4 years where the models were labeled for quantification.
So how do you, I mean, it sounds like that it's not being requested by the client, its use. You're saying that you've only seen it asked for in a couple of tenders. Is this something that needs to change? We need to start seeing it being an integral part of a tender.
Look, we are not waiting for the client to, ask us to be more efficient. We are very keen to get there. It's more about, not trying to get there too fast, and on the way there, try to do something that is not mature enough or is not fit for purpose. So if we have been given 2 sets of information, right, model data sets and traditional data sets, and the traditional data set has been labeled as the source of information to price with. And we have to go with that. And we don't have time, especially at the tenders, to look at two sets of information. And if the model set is labeled as just for information, we're not going to base our decisions on that or make a time investment at the tender stage.
Okay. Okay. So Wissam and Alain, actually, I'm going to ask you both the same question, but I'll ask it of Wissam first. So for an engaged client, this control and monitoring that you start to get from increased BIM usage gives them a lot more clarity on a project. So how is this information really advantageous for them? How is it being used?
So every time we talk about the client added value, we need to sit in their place. They are just interested in the final product. They're interested, as Alain mentioned, how can I better manage my risk? What is the added value for me? Whether we want to use 4D, 5D, 6D, or whatever a new terminology is going to come, they're not really going to dictate that approach. So from our end, for example, from a PMC perspective, we started to utilize the 4D, not to do like logistics or a very detailed contractor perspective, but this is part of our day-to-day control and monitoring from a construction status reporting procedure. So we started to move from the normal standard Gantt chart approach into a more illustrative approach where we can do a comparative analysis between as-built, between a plan, and we can actually report back what happened, why there's certain activities should have been completed versus not, what was the issue. And this type of 4D analysis, for example, we started to use it for certain items which are going to convert into our claims, because claim is all about telling the story. From a 5D perspective, we started to do kind of an assessment to see how can the cash flow assessment be connected to approved work inspection process and used for payment validations. So we started to investigate on those ideas, and from a client point of view, this is an added value for them because the process is more lean, information is better clear, there's a faster way to report, there's a faster way to identify if there's a specific item which is missing. So it goes back to the risk, it goes to how this information is increasing the productivity of managing the project and providing more answers in a more clarity to that client. So this is where 4D and 5D specifically, if we're talking about those two, can support the client from that perspective.
Okay, so Alain, as taking on what Wissam has just said, the other side, I suppose, is the client can start to see what's can actually be done when you're starting to ask, claim for payments. They'll know whether what you're saying is complete.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. If we really need to think about more specific use cases, and just to echo what Arsen was saying a minute ago around what's the model fit for, it's the client responsibility from the very beginning to establish a context in which we're going to say, right, we're going to use models and create information models, BIM, for taking these decisions or those decisions, because those are core to the eventual outcome of my project. And so you define which BIM users are going to be implemented on this project. And so we just heard from Wissam how a contractor can start evidencing claims. Me as a client, I'm rather the opposite. I'd rather get myself in a position where there are no claims. So if we look at the first BIM use, we'd say, for example, as a client, I want a lower risk for the contractor in creating their bids, because then I will see these lower risk reflected in lower tender prices. So that's what we saw when the clients start thinking about what I want from my design supply chain is better bidding information, because that will over time reduce the embedded risk in that information transmittal. And then immediately back to the point of Arsen, then you say, right, well, this needs to be declared. And it's really important that it needs to be declared upfront, that the contractual document might be the drawing, that the models are going to be there for information. What do we mean by that? We mean that they've been created to enable first, the production of the contractual design information, which is the drawings, which are QA'd, but also a better design understanding. It says, if you want to do something else, a more advanced BIM use says quantify it, okay, then we need quantification method. We need the model production method that can be QA'd and validated, and then the supply chain would be able to quantify it. I would say, going back to risk and going back to cost, why do you want to quantify the model? Actually, if you look at the construction price, about 50%, if not more, is process. So a description of the asset without a description of the process does not actually allow you to get a better price, because you need a description of the construction method and see whether the construction method can be optimized to really get a lower tender price. So I think we really need to get everybody in this mindset of saying, how do I use information to reduce my risk and optimize my process towards lower tender price? And stop about talking about caricature, which are not linked whatsoever to a real, tangible, measurable outcome for the client or the contractors. And these facts are available. They might not be in the tech vendor brochure, but they are available. They are available from academia, and we need to be very tangible and specific on promoting BIM so that we deliver an outcome. I think we hear too much from the tech vendor saying, buy this computer, there is an ROI. But you'll figure out what you use it. You've bought the computer, my job is done, I'm moving out. Now, we as professionals need to articulate, thank you for sending me the computer, now I'm gonna use it for something very tangible, very specific, very measurable.
I mean, is that, sorry, just asking everybody else, does everybody agree with that there needs to be much more, upfront tangibility about how to use these technologies? Is that something that the other panelists agree with?
I would say, yeah, the definition has to be there. But like, if the client was to come to us and say, you have to use the model for this, and this, and we are already doing that, and we're maturing these aspects of it, we will not charge him extra. But if you were to say to us, bring the moon from the sky, we would have charged him for that extra. So there is that aspect of it as well, the impact of requirements.
I think there's this conversation around value. And of course, if somebody is creating an asset and information that is value downstream, there is this issue. There's clearly is an issue around, hey, it's costing me more, and you are realizing a little bit more value. And so have that conversation. But intelligent clients, they want to listen. In fact, they are bored of our industry that just continuously go on a cost down and not a value up. So I think the intelligent client are listening, they're sensing. And in fact, it's quite interesting that if we look at some of the standards that have been written, they are there to help the client understand. ISO 19650, which is the standard for information management in model-based workflows, which is clearly, it's trying to define and say to a client, right, what you want is better information because that will allow you to do better decision, lower cost, higher efficiency, lower risk. And so it starts with what is the organizational information requirement? What do your organization need in terms of information to be able to make a better decision? So starts there, and it says, right, now that we know that each organization does that, transmit it to the other way, and it sets up the requirement for an exchange of information. And then this exchange of information is then placed into the contract. ISO 19650 is just there to set up information transactions. But these information transactions, which are model-based, let's call that BIM for a minute, is there with a purpose. It needs to have a purpose. The client, the contractor, the designer need to be absolutely clear that we're going to set up this information transaction to a purpose, to an end that is quantifiable. Nobody bought computers to do because it was nice to have a computer on their desk. all accountants had to buy a computer once the spreadsheet was invented. Would you go to an accountancy firm that does not use spreadsheets? I wouldn't. Computer and databases were invented by banks to manage our money. Would you go into a bank branch that doesn't have a computer connected to a database? No. Tomorrow, imagine a world where the client refuses to go to a contractor or to a designer that is just using last generation technology. I can't run the kind of company that a construction company or a design company is if I had to use Excel. I can't build a BMW on Excel. I can't run a bank on Excel. Why are we running construction on Excel? It's insane. We need to write down what is the use of technology.
Okay, so I think that's really trying to say that the whole industry needs to embrace this, you know, wherever you are in the value chain, if I'm understanding you correctly. Okay, so I want to move the conversation on a bit, and I want to bring everybody else in. But first, Alain, I'll just stick with you for a moment, and then I'm going to bring everybody else back in, which is, I want to, because this is an area I know you know very well, I want to ask you about the asset information aspect. So, you know, that provides the baseline for FM and O&M. It's introducing new benefits. So again, what needs to be in place? How should it be approached? How do you make sure this is a success? And then what I'll do is I'll bring everybody else in to explore just slightly different aspects of this level.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting thing, because ultimately we have to remember that the asset that we build has a utility. It's there because it's a retail space. It is there because it's a museum. So I think that we need to use technology into that domain, and the kind of systems like Massimo or Tririga allowed us to manage those buildings effectively before we had BIM. Now we have the next level of resolution and description of the asset using BIM technology to do that, and BIM representation. Let's call that an asset information model. Let's connect it to IoT sensors, and let's call that a digital twin. And you have a huge generation of use cases that allow you to understand how the asset works and performs. You can optimize its running, you can make it reactive. All these use cases are really, really valuable. I would argue that the most valuable part of that is to understand how the existing asset performs because before I build the next one, I'd like that next one to be a version 2 rather than a version 1 again. So getting a really good insight on the operational performance. So maybe having an FM system that is higher performance because it runs on BIM, then allows me and a design firm to design version 2 of a better office, a better retail space, a better transportation hub. And I would like to be even more controversial, is to say, the cost of initializing that data set is roughly $200 per A0 drawing. So the fact that the construction supply chain is unable to deliver a record of what they've built digitally because they've only got a random version of what they've built physically anyway, because their supply chain did. Actually, I would argue for the owner that until construction really has adopted digital techniques, get a third party to build you a digital asset. It costs you, as I said, about $200 per drawings. You will get a high quality information, and you will be in a position to understand what really has been built. So you will be able to turn to your contractor and say, my team that's constructing the digital twin or the asset information model has informed me that those assets have not been built. I'm not paying your partial invoice. The data we have, again, fact-based, 75% of items installed by tier 2 supply chain are out of tolerance by more than 30 centimeters. Yes, I've just said 75% of what construction firm install at site are out of tolerance by 30 centimeters. It is impossible to think that we are going to get anywhere better assets until these kind of things are fixed. And I think it is the responsibility of the owner to stop paying the construction supply chain for bad work.
Okay, so I think there's quite a lot in there. Juan, you're at the front of the process. So, how are you looking at and using this level of BIM? Because, listening to some of the comments made there, I mean, you're not doing the actual construction, but you're at the kind of design planning stage.
So in terms of sustainability, how we are using sustainability for as within the process of using BIM. Of course, during design, we use and we integrate within our design teams, our sustainability teams, from the beginning to perform building performance, to analyze and to take decisions on better arrangements on the building orientation, of the materials selected, of the MEP systems that will be integrated in order to have a better performance within the building and to provide less operational cost to the building. That's during the design stages. Then during construction and at the end of at the handover of the construction, during commissioning, what we ensure is that the right systems are being in place, that the same design that has been designed is going to be used as well. If there are any modifications, we do an analysis of all these outcomes and any possible resolutions of that. And during operations and maintenance, similarly, if the client has required either something similar as what Alain was mentioning, a digital twin of the building to do an analysis of how the energy is being utilized, if there are any points that can be improved to increase the operational gain. And by using that, what we are currently doing is that either we go to buildings that we have designed and we do an analysis after they're in use to see how the building is performing and to provide recommendations in order to achieve better energy consumption and cost savings in terms of energy.
And are you using that then for your future as well, future designs, that type of information?
So till now, what we are doing is that we are getting, as Wissam was saying, probably one of the key here is to make use of the data. And all the historical data is what we are currently analyzing and getting all that data as history in order to learn from the past. Certain applications can make use of artificial intelligence and learn from the past to make better decisions. So we are also, depending on the building use and the occupation of the building, we analyze that data based on either historical data or recommendations that we think it will fit to make a better operational gains in the asset.
And does that take a lot of learning? And I don't mean machine learning, I mean human learning on how to do that, how to ask the right questions and make sure you've got the right data to be able to question it properly.
Well, as usual, of course, the learning path is depending on the use of technology. The use of technology to adopt digital twins and artificial intelligence is quite new in a way. The maturity of that is still to be fully developed, and it's, I will say, in my opinion, that still need to be improved and wider open in order to be able to learn more from it. And in terms of the use of sustainability for the use of in BIM, it's quite widely used during design and during commissioning. Now, during operations and maintenance is less commonly used, and the learning path might be slower than during the previous stages. Okay.
So Arsen, Juan, at the very beginning of what he was saying there, mentioned handover, and I think that's quite a good point for me to bring you in, actually, because from a contractor perspective, what can be learned about the streamlining of the BIM handover process to the client? You know, are there recommendations that you would make to people to make sure that it's as smooth as possible, whilst also making sure that the client gets what they're after?
Yes, we have had almost 3 projects now where we have had digital asset handover at the end. And apparently the first one was the most difficult because we were learning. And it was a pilot for our client, for ourselves, and our supply chain. So the lessons we learned on this first project, which was a major infrastructure project, namely an airport expansion project, was the owner was the operator as well. So the requirements were very bespoke. Okay, so it was custom requirements for an owner operator of a specific type of facility, a very complex type of facility. So this was a pilot for the client, the first BIM mandated project for us as a main contractor. It was 5 years ago. And the market and technology and everything else wasn't necessarily there where it is today. So one of the biggest obstacles or difficulties we had back then was the specifics of asset information requirements coming almost towards the end of the project, where we had to almost rework with our supply chain in many areas to bring these models up to speed and fulfill the information requirements, even including some physical asset tagging work.
Do you mean by that there was information that you realized you needed that you hadn't realized you needed at the beginning of the process, so you had to effectively retrospectively
Yeah.
go back and find that information? Okay, sorry.
Correct. Or you had that information in a traditional or separate repository, and you had to bring it, integrate it into model elements, because you were not expecting a turn of events to go that way. But having said that, the last couple of projects that we are handing over as we speak in the Expo 2020, I think we have been able to ask the right questions at the right time in the project, and we have prepared ourselves and our supply chain to get there along the process, not to start reworking at the end of the project. This is where I see the information requirements, asset information requirements, being made clear as early in the process as possible from the owners and operators.
Okay, so Wissam, now you've been sitting here quietly listening to everything that's been said over the last 7 to 10 minutes, and it's been quite a lively discussion. An area.
Yeah, I didn't know which point to push, but yeah, obviously it's an interesting discussion.
Well, feel free to respond to anything that's been said, but also I want to ask you, an area I think that causes a little bit of confusion when we're at this level of BIM, in terms of that advanced use, the O&M, is you start to get that kind of grey area, the overlapping almost, it feels, between BIM and a digital twin. And digital twins seem to be fairly easy to explain and understand. It's an exact replica, a digital replica of a building and how people interact with it. Do you find that the industry gets a little bit confused between BIM O&M and digital twins, and what are the key differences that mean that they both have their place?
Sure. So let's start from a terminology perspective, and this is the reason why people get a little bit confused. When we identify what BIM is a digital representation of your building. It has the geometry, it has the assets, it has the information. So when we provide the same terminology for a digital twin, it's still considered a digital representation of an actual physical asset. This is where the confusion happens. Now, from a practical perspective, both of those two terminologies, they have completely two different process, intent, and usages. BIM, it's a data bank for you. So it's going to contain the geometry, the assets, the specs, the on-them. At an handover stage, this BIM data, it's static. So it does not change until you manually do a specific change. It does not provide any added value if that data stayed there by itself, because the usages for design, construction, all of that has been completed. Digital twin, from a practical perspective, it's a live model. It's an interactive model. It keeps collecting analytical information from the building, and this digital twin approach need to do analysis. So there's data analytics, there's artificial intelligence, there's recommended solutions, there's a preventive message for your optimization of your energy. So BIM from that perspective, it's static. Digital twin, it's interactive. It's providing this feedback and providing that added value. Now, obviously, and we mentioned this before, that everything goes back to data. So you have to make sure that the BIM is being built up properly. It's provided that accurate data so that you can run digital twin. So digital twin is dependent on this specific data. Now the question is, can you do a digital twin without the BIM? In principle, yes, you can. You just have to go through all over the manual work again and again and again. And then you have to pay an extra money to get that level of accuracy, that level of detail. Now, because of we're trying to make sure that the full life cycle of the project, even from a client perspective, they can make usage of this data, we have to make sure that there is a kind of like lean information or a kind of a easy process, open process between the BIM and digital twin. But both of them, they have completely different usages, especially when we're talking about handover stage and moving for operation and maintenance.
And do you think that, based on, I think, partly what Alain was saying and generally what's been said here, it sounds to me, as somebody who's outside looking in, that there some of the key decisions around what needs to be in place, how to expertly use BIM at these kind of more advanced levels is still a bit nebulous. It's not quite there. Is that right? And how are you moving it forwards?
It is right, because I believe maybe Arsen and Alain mentioned this term. It's all about the business set, the business mind. So if I'm a client and I want to say, we need to implement BIM on this project, we need to really understand what is the added value, right? So this is where we start doing a backward method. So I'm a client and I'm looking for a 20 years exercise. I'm not gonna just focus on a BIM requirements for quantities or BIM requirements for design or more control and monitoring. Clients are interested obviously in the big picture. So this is why those level of information based on a specific usages need to be identified at day one, so that the designer will provide the specific BIM for what the client needs, plus what their internal process requirements. Contractor will take an advantage of this BIM use, also taking into consideration the BIM database from a client perspective, whether they want to use it for procurement or for control. And obviously the handover stage, this is where all the rich asset is. So if we don't have this mindset from day one and it's properly coordinated, you will see the designer doing BIM just for their own shop drawing production collaboration, 3D beautiful images. Contractor are using BIM for their own need. And then we need to figure out all of this story and have a very similar debate of why we invested in BIM when we reach handover stage. So it is the responsibility here of consultants, us as a professional from day one. Mr. Client, this is the 7th D, 8th D, nth D added value of your BIM. Let's start doing specific requirements and connect the dots so that the clients can see this overall full picture. And this is in the proper case where designer will be happy, contractors will understand it, and overall, you have a fully integrated process.
Okay. I'm going to move to, we've got lots of questions coming through. So shortly, I'm going to move to the questions from the audience. But before we do, I think what I would like to do is just from each of you, get a very brief bullet point summary of how do you differentiate the same BIM usages from design, client, contractor, etc. point of view. So I'll start with Juan and then I'll just jump to each of you, just that bullet point view of how do you do that?
So just to reiterate what everyone has said is in terms of to make sure that everyone understands what BIM is. BIM is the actual use throughout all the life cycle of any asset. So throughout all of these different stages where designers are involved, or contractors, or facility management, each of them may have different objectives and goals set by the client. And that's why it's very important to set up at the beginning by the asset owner of what these requirements are. What do they expect from the designers? What do they expect from the contractor? What do they expect from the facility management? The different goals and objectives are being used during design, It's mainly related to coordination, to the production of the deliverables out of a 3D model, and that the information exchange between the different involved parties are used through a common data environment, a single point of truth that improve the informed decisions and less, sorry, and more information based on the correct use of data.
Okay. And Arsen, from your point of view, from the contractor point of view?
Yes, I would maybe take the permission to speak for everyone, or from the common sense. I think when you do BIM, you don't do BIM. So basically you do something else, depending on where you are in the supply chain. We are the contractor, we build buildings. So BIM is not what we do, BIM is how we do it, right? So I think it's always important to, probably as Wissam mentioned and everybody else on the call, I think we are on the same page, where we need to define the purpose, be able to answer simple plain language questions as to why in every instance or every use case, and then it will help us do more meaningful BIM processes without duplicating already existing sets of processes, but rather using BIM as a means and methods to modernize existing processes in achieving, as an organization, as a stakeholder, as an entity, exactly what we were doing before as a business, as a core business, but better.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Wissam, from the client point of view?
Yeah, so again, similar to our discussion today, clients are interested in the end results. Whether you want to use it in whatever tool, whatever approach, whatever new technology, just let me see the end result. The end result is always projects with better quality, less time, and better return of investment on the money. So these are the three main points they are interested in. Now, if BIM can support them to do a faster decision-making tool so that they can pick the right tool before they go to the market, then BIM will provide for them that specific set of added value. If BIM will help the client to assess their feasibility assessment based on a specific design, using this automation of quantity takeoff, then this is where they will be interested in BIM. We've talked a lot about the FM, about the operation. So it's all about the end result, all about the end value. And again, the experiences that we started to see in the market, because we're providing a lot of awareness session for the clients are started to asking specific questions. Since this technology is available, can you do this for me? Can I make this faster? Is there a way that you can show me those type of assessment in a faster way? So now the client started to elaborate more requests from us in order to, or more requests in the way that they can understand the value better and they can take advantage of this tool. And this is part of our added value that we are pushing to the industry. We want to support the client, not only just prepare a final product, but within this journey, we also want to support them with less headaches, less risk, and better control on their added value.
And Alain, from your point of view?
Yeah, as BuroHappold, I think we want to be, and we are the trusted advisor that help client achieve their outcome. And so the first immediate emanation of that is when you see a design coming out of the ground, like Museum of the Future. So to echo what Arsen said, we don't want to talk about these three little letters. We're really talking about what is more effective for the client. So they need to perceive a much more effective design. So for BuroHappold, that would mean, for example, a much more integrated design where the best designer was able to collaborate and work and transmit their design to the client. So in the case of Museum of the Future, for example, we had a model-based workflow. The design was distributed worldwide because that way we can have the best designer applying their thought to that design. we're multidisciplinary, 23 different skills and specialism onto that building on the Sheikh Zayed Road. That's projected from people in New York doing museography, or people in Bath doing facade. And I think that's really how the client needs to perceive it. Better consulting experience, better understanding of the design choices and the design recommendations that are being made. And of course, them being able to immerse themselves into the design. So it was delivered on iPads and the like. And then very important, we want computer augmented design. We are designers, so we use a lot of generative design. So you see that the design agility, not only the design resolution and the design understanding and the design integration is better, but the design agility, we can option here. The whole optimization of the grid, for example, the structural grid that you saw being assembled in the computer, that was fully computationally designed and was redesigned iteratively as more information and new constraints were added. And then that was handed actually to the contractor, and they brought new constraints around sequence because the site is exiguous, etc. So we see that we don't talk about BIM. We talk about the outcomes that the client is going and is going to get. And then as their trusted advisor to echo with them, they says, right, but is the better design all that we need? And they said, how can this that technology augmentation towards my objective could be reached? And we then work as strategic advisor to the client to say, right, for this to work, you're gonna need to mandate these people to deliver this information to bid better. Or we need to start getting some information around embedded carbon or operational use and feed that back as constraints. How is that gonna happen? So really always think about it in those terms. To make it work, bullet point is, a strategic digital a digital strategy needs to be in place, and then make sure that every party is augmenting what they do through technology.
And actually, I think you made a very good point there, which is that when you get to the point where you're not talking about the technology, you know that it's embedded and people just know how to use it, and it's about the function and the outcome then, and not about the actual technology itself. So moving to questions, we have loads and loads of questions here. I'll start with one, which is, and I'm not sure who this will be, so please leap in. How can BIM be used for delay analysis, improving extension of time claims?
I'm happy to actually not answer the question and says, is it not time for our industry to be on time and not claim? We have an industry that is built on creating delays that we're predictable and then claiming. I think that we should remember and learn. In 2011, the East Coast contractors, GC2 size, that build schools, managed to have such a level of certainty in terms of plans that they were able to bid no variation contract. That day, the contractor industry in North America was redefined, that making money out of delays and claim was not more a business model, and every school needs to be delivered on time and on budget, because you contractually will not be allowed to claim. We should be using technology to build a better industry and better outcomes, not to weaponize technology to make more bad behavior more profitable.
So maybe the question should be, how do you use BIM for a delay analysis to make sure it doesn't happen? If I phrase it that way.
We are actually making great progress on that, but I'd like to ask the panel, for them, building, is it a verb or is it a noun? Because when it was invented, it was a verb. And today we are very far away from describing the construction process per se. Therefore, we are not really using BIM in construction to describe what construction is, which is a production process. Therefore, we are not putting production under control. When we get that, we get to incredible status. We did a project, Maze Construction in the UK did a project called the Jumping Factory. The site ran on a 7-minute takt time. So let's be clear, every 7-minute slot was accounted. Every activity in the site was accounted within a 7-minute window. If the truck didn't deliver within that 7 minutes window, it was deemed to be late. Now, this is extraordinary to think about a site that runs at a productivity level of 7 minutes. Now, that is when you suddenly have a breakthrough performance. And those people that are delivering those breakthrough performance are going to be rewarded by the market that actually contract people by refusing to pay claims and by letting them execute and produce and make profit from being better at building.
Okay. So, Arsen, I've got a question here for you. How do you engage subcontractors in BIM implementation, considering they may not have the capabilities or the skills, etc.? So how do you get them in?
For us as a main contractor, I think it goes almost the same way as onboarding a new department, like we did with the planning or we did with operations, other than the people who are with an innate ability, continuing from design to BIM. So what we do is we generally trying to, other than the contractual language and the requirement, obviously, we're trying to motivate the subcontractors on future business, and that this is the new norm. And if you want business with us in the future, it's better to comply and do it from now. And other than that, in addition, we're trying to also find motivations and demonstrate the subcontractors that they have, as an organization, on this project, they have benefits by using BIM along with the rest of the supply chain as well. And if they don't, they're not only going to, not be compliant or not do their part, but also they're going to influence other people's work.
But is it down to you to do the training to make sure that they know what they're doing and can use it properly?
We're probably doing more like a consulting and advisory type of session to bring them on board and sell the idea. But when it comes to training and upskilling or supporting them to do the work, we have an enormous supply chain of BIM service providers where they tap into and they get that service. So we don't fish for them.
Okay.
We show them how to fish in a very broad way.
Okay. Wissam, question here about the materials side. So I think this is probably you. Do you see bulk materials becoming more integrated with BIM anytime soon? And then the question goes on to say, these are not easy to integrate with materials libraries.
Sure. I just have a comment, please, if you allow me. It goes back to the claim. I didn't want to interrupt Arsen, and a couple of feedbacks from Alain's point of view. When it comes to claim, yes, in principle, what Alain was pushing for, it makes sense that eventually we need to utilize the technology to have a claim-free project. But let's be practical here. This is not going to happen for quite a good time. Constructions are complicated regardless of the technology. Technology is advancing, but the technology and the requirements are advancing as well. So kind of the risk is moving kind of side by side with the advancement. Number three, there's always people involved, people with different skills, with different technicalities. On a complicated projects, you have people coming from different backgrounds, different communications. There is always going to be this type of challenge, kind of like issues which are not 100% aligned. So there's a lot of reasons which we're going to maintain a claim, well, until we have robotics obviously building the project, then we can actually really tend to by the minute where the delay is. But to that end, I would say that we shouldn't push to have a claim-free project in principle. We should manage the risk and make sure that the BIM tools actually are supporting the management of that claims. This means that there's a lot of money that has been wasted on claims and back and forth discussions. Within your BIM approach, you can still manage all of that because you can take more accurate data on a specific timing. You can interpret this from a better construction perspective. If there is a delay, the history of the delay, the purpose of the delay, the teams which cause the delays, all of those, they can be monitored. It will give you this opportunity to be a proactive approach. This is where now we're moving toward prevention of claim. But also we need to think both ways. We need the data to support us on the claim, plus the data to help us to prevent a claim. So I know we can keep back and forth on this. I just want to jump back, Rob, to your questions. Materials, specifications, and data information. So we started to see BIM usage for the procurement packages. So this is where the BIM information can be used in order to take the information from the designer, right, and take it to the market, and people will start bid on those materials and the specs using the BIM database. So on those specific instances at that specific constraints for the construction, the BIM data is needed. Yes, we need to put the material information, and obviously this information will be updated to go to handover as we discussed with operations and manuals, just to close that point.
So I've got another question here that might throw another little grenade into the conversation. So can clients not mandate the sharing of models from concept to handover so that we have a central point of information progressively developed? Sometimes the contractors are not willing to adapt. I guess that is Juan and Arsen, that question.
In that sense, I mean, as we are saying, is that the use of BIM is the use of the same information throughout multiple stages, and not to ensure that the handover between the different parties involved is seamless and there is no loss of information, or the information is not lost during that transition between different parties involved in the process. So given that, as Arsen was saying, most of the clients and asset owners, they are not including the models as part of the package that is being meant to be used in that sense, so that the handover between different stakeholders is as seamless as it was meant to be by using BIM workflows. I believe that the maturity of clients and asset owners is increasing, and little by little and step by step, I think that we'll get there. And at the end of the day, at some point, even we will move to the maturity level of BIM level 3, where we can even collaboratively work all together within the same environment. And that's the final goal of using BIM, I believe.
And Arsen?
Alain brought a good example just now, talking about a certainty of the contract in 2011 where there was no claim, right? And that's purely based on certainty of information. So I think what happens quite recently, maybe in the last 7-8 years, is with all the due respect, in this region at least, the contracts are overlapping with stages so much so that the designer doesn't have time and budget to finish his work, and most of this work gets pushed over to the contracting stage. And regardless whether you mandate or do not mandate a set of processes, the information is already defected, and the use of technology is almost necessary to fix the defect. So it's also a time management issue, time and budget management issue, because you have to spend a certain amount of money on completing the design, and, bringing it to a stage where it's buildable. You have to do it one way or another. So it's better to leave the design work with the designers. And for people like us, we want to get information that is already there. We don't want to touch it. We just want to take and go into site and build it. That's what I can tell from our experience.
I just want to add a little bit of granularity to that question, because it mentioned the integrated project delivery IPD form, which was delivered by Reed and Fisher in Stanford. So the IPD contract form proposes that a new contract special purpose vehicle is created where all the team come together, and then in that environment they can deliver more collaboratively and create a better description of the information. And there's a lot of parallel to the BIM level 2 in the UK to give it its full title, which is collaborative delivery based on model workflows. And so both have this concept that it's going to become more collaborative. So that's a huge cultural shift, right? You can put all sorts of things in contract. Ultimately, the reason why at Museum of the Future we are successful with a model-based workflow is because from the beginning, there is no alternative but to be collaborative. You do not build such an artifact if people don't commit to being collaborative. And I think that's a very, very important point. And to bring back to Arsen's point around design, I think there is this misconception that design is something that is finished. What is really interesting is actually if you consider design in construction, you know, we continuously design. In fact, the final design of where does this screw goes is done by the tier 3 sub that is attaching its ventilation duct, etc. So we historically design is, you know, done by Hilti, right? When you actually make the hole into the wall, and we have therefore that distributed design stage. So we don't have I fully completely design and describe what I will build and then later on build it. It would not be cost effective. It would not be time possible. So we have to understand how this distributed design and collaborative design process and how the different contributors to the design are being integrated. Because ultimately, the best person to know how to design, eventually how to fit the lift, is the person that has designed the lift. But up front, it is the role of the designer and the vertical movement designer to think through what is the performance of the lift that gives me the right core efficiencies and the right experience in that building. And so understanding that really distributed nature of design, it's ongoing integration over the delivery of the capital asset is fundamental to moving the technology on and saying, how does technology really support the construction and the design throughout the process? And we have built an industry around A0 and human brain. Now it's time to build an industry around technology and databases, and it's going to look very different.
Okay. So, well, I think there are a lot of buildings in Dubai, to be honest with you, where they've forgotten about how the lift should best function to move people around. We're running out of time, but I've got a couple of questions here which I think we can get through fairly quickly. So if we can get some short answers. One of them here: in many countries there are third-party websites to download libraries. Where do our panelists download from or go to get their data? Anybody? Is that a question?
I can answer. In BuroHappold, we mine around data. We create around data. We do not like to import uncurated, unspecified data. So if it's specifically to the use of Revit family, we believe that the Revit family encode the data and the behavior of the objects that we need for our purpose and to create the data deliverable that the supply chain wants to their standard. We've received an EIR, and we also have internal information requirement to make our analysis work. And to do that, what we have actually a company called kinship.io that systematically mine every model and gets those high quality objects that our designers have created and then distribute them across the world for everybody to reuse. But that's one approach.
All right. So Wissam, this one is definitely in your ballpark. With respect to digital twin implementation of existing assets through laser scanning, etc., is there an operational cost saving percentage range available from actual case studies in the GCC?
Very tricky question. Everyone is asking this $50 million question. To my knowledge, there isn't a specific set of a document that can have specific facts. There's certain opportunities and certain ideas which are promising enough, but to my knowledge, there isn't a specific project with a specific requirements. Basically, what we need to do, you need, first of all, even if you have activated digital twin today, you need to wait 3 or 4 years to understand, in a comparison with a different approach, how this new technology is saving on the maintenance and the operation. So it will take a while until we see really accurate number that makes sense.
Okay, this one is possibly Arsen. What part of BIM is dedicated to early works, like earthworks for foundations, utilities, etc.? Can machine control solutions be helpful here?
Well, I think early works is just as the part of the project as everything else. So as a contractor, we expect early works, earthworks, or site BIM models to come through as part of the IFC. And if not, we tend to develop those ourselves because there is plenty of logistics, excavation, and things that go into it that require quantification, that require planning, that requires integration with the main building. So in cases where it's not part of the IFC, we tend to fulfill that ourselves. And it usually is part of our direct works. In some projects where there's a major infrastructure surrounding the building, it becomes a separate package and is done by a package contract.
What is the most common task where BIM can help save time for a technician at facility management stage, especially in maintenance?
Yeah, so there is something called, from an operation perspective, it's the response time. And this is how it's one of the main KPIs when you do operation. Response time is when there is an issue triggered, whether it was a leak or an electrical problem or a request for maintenance, how much time do you need, or that operation team needs, to achieve on site, fix, and close it? BIM will support, obviously, on one of the added values from BIM is that aspect, because it can provide a specific space allocation attribute where it triggers on iPhone or a specific unit from the technician. He or she doesn't need to be aware of the information. They just follow a specific path. Not only that, the system enough, if you have the proper sensors, they can just trigger on a specific connection point that specific valve or that specific panel, it has an issue. So you know exactly actually which specific part of the network you need to handle. So all of the space allocation to provide this easy communication is part of this big set of an added value, yes.
Okay, I think final question then, because we are really a little bit over time actually, but there's been a lot of interest and still questions coming through now. So this question is, which form of contracts currently have BIM systems or tool inclusion as a clause in the Middle East market? I don't know if that's one that is answerable.
There isn't a form of contract, basically. A contract is a contract. These are requirements, or these are the EIRs, or these are the specific scope of service that need to be developed. No one will say, to my knowledge, there's nothing called a BIM. There's a BIM protocol, which maybe defines what is the specific language, specific usages. It doesn't dictate to be a contract, to my knowledge, but it's a client requirement. It will be dealt as a project deliverable.
But at the same time, none of the standard forms of contract that we use today, the likes of FIDIC, for example, none of them have, even in their latest version, have anything BIM integrated.
So they should.
It always becomes an additional appendix or annexure to the standard form of contract.
Okay.
I think the best practice is to look at generation 2, which is ISO 19650, that creates a language and a standards to include into your contract. So you write it to that. In the UK, the UK BIM framework is in fact a description of how the ISO 19650 language can be used into the contract, and then you need to include it as part of your commercial lawyer will include in the contract the way to contract it. And I did put the name May Winfield as an expert in that field. You can download her papers or watch her webinar. And in fact, it is not enough to say in the contract, do BIM. You have to define from the beginning, I think, as this discussion has shown, what is the purpose and what's the outcomes you're looking for, and then translate that into a contract language. We are now fortunate that we have ISO 19650 as a referenceable specific words and wording that we can use in that contract.
Okay, thank you, Alain. And I think we will close it there because we're over time and there's still a lot of questions. We'll try and put some of the questions into our Ventures Connect LinkedIn feed, and hopefully some people will be able to answer those questions. But thank you to our speakers. It has been an extremely lively conversation. I think everybody will agree with that. Lots of interesting, good discussion, differing opinions, which is really what you want when you have a conversation like this. Thank you to you, the audience, because again, you're engaged and you've asked a lot of questions. I can see lots of questions coming up on my Q&A feed here. And with that, thank you for your time. We'll see you again in a few months, and goodbye.